In 1969, engineers sat down and asked a question nobody had seriously asked before. What's the absolute limit of what a locomotive can do? Not what's practical. Not what makes financial sense. The absolute limit. And what came out of that question was 8 machines, each one built to do something the world had never seen. One hauled iron ore through Minnesota winters with the pulling force of nothing else on rails. One recycled its own steam to survive the African desert. One was so big, so heavy, that Union Pacific had to reinforce the tracks just to run it. These are not the most famous locomotives in history. Some of them most people have never heard of. But every single one of them pushed engineering somewhere it had never been before. This is the story of the world's most extreme locomotives. May 10th, 1969, Utah, Promontory Summit. 100 years earlier, 2 railroad crews met at this exact spot and drove a golden spike into the ground, and just like that, America was connected coast to coast for the first time in history. Union Pacific wanted to mark that moment, and they didn't want to show up with flowers. They showed up with this. The DDA40X, 98 feet long, 270 tons. 2 complete diesel engines sitting inside a single body, each one alone powerful enough to haul a respectable freight train. Together, they produced 600 horsepower, making this the most powerful single-unit diesel locomotive ever built. A record it still holds today. They called it the Centennial, because it was born for that birthday. But here's the part that gets glossed over. Union Pacific didn't just order this locomotive. They designed it from scratch. Unlike every other double diesel that came before it, the DDA40X wasn't 2 locomotives bolted together and called something new. It was a completely original machine, built from the ground up with one goal: be the best thing on tracks anywhere, full stop. And for a while, it genuinely was. 47 of them were built between 1969 and 1971. They ran freight across Wyoming, through the Rockies, mile after mile, hauling loads that would have needed multiple locomotives just a decade earlier. But by 1985, every single one was retired. Not because they broke down, not because they failed, because running 2 engines inside one body costs twice the maintenance, and smaller, cheaper locomotives were getting the same job done for less money. That's the brutal truth about being the most powerful. It's never enough on its own. 13 Centennials survived into preservation. Only one number 6936 still runs. Union Pacific keeps it alive for special occasions. A living reminder of the day a railroad decided to celebrate its history by building something the world had never seen before. And honestly, it worked. Now here's where things get interesting. Ask any railroad fan to name the most powerful steam locomotive ever built, and 9 out of 10 will say Big Boy. Without hesitation, like it's common knowledge. And they're wrong. Meet the Yellowstone. Built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1941 for a railroad in Minnesota called the Duluth. Mississippi and Iron Range, a railroad that most people outside the railfan world have never even heard of. And that's exactly why this locomotive never got the fame it deserved. But the numbers don't lie. The Yellowstone produced a tractive effort of 140,000 pounds. The Big Boy? 135,375. That means this machine, this largely forgotten ore hauler from the frozen north of Minnesota, could pull harder than the most famous steam locomotive in American history. And it did it quietly, without a nickname, without a Hollywood moment, without anyone chalking something clever on its smoke box. So what was it actually doing up there? Iron ore. That's it. That was the whole mission. The Mesabi Iron Range in northern Minnesota was one of the richest iron ore deposits on the planet. And the DM&IR's job was simple: take that ore from the mines and get it to the docks at Duluth and 2 harbors on Lake Superior, where ships were waiting to carry it to steel mills across the country. Sounds straightforward. It wasn't. Iron ore is brutally heavy. We're not talking about hauling grain or timber here. These trains were dense, grinding, punishing loads, and there was a specific grade climbing from Duluth up to the Proctor yards that made every single run a test of pure mechanical strength. The Yellowstone was built for exactly that fight. 128 feet long, nearly 1 million pounds fully loaded with coal and water. 26 tons of coal in the tender, 25,000 gallons of water. And when it was working at full power burning through 10 to 12 tons of coal every single hour. To put that in perspective, the amount of coal this locomotive burned in 1 hour was enough to heat a house through an entire Minnesota winter. Think about that for a second. 18 of these were built in total, 8 in 1941. 10 more in 1943 when World War II pushed iron ore demand through the roof. And during the war, the DM&IR actually loaned some of these locomotives to other railroads that were struggling under wartime traffic. The Denver and Rio Grande Western borrowed a few, and when they sent them back. They wired a telegram to the DM&IR saying these were the finest steam locomotives that had ever operated on their railroad. High praise from people who knew exactly what a great locomotive felt like. But by 1960, it was over. Diesel had arrived, and the economics were impossible to argue with. The last Yellowstone made its final ore run on July 5, 1960. 3 survive today, numbers 225, 227. And 229 sitting in static display, never to move again. No resurrection story, no heritage excursion program, just retirement and silence. Which is honestly a shame, because this machine deserved a lot more than it got. Okay, so here's a question. What does it take for a locomotive to become genuinely culturally famous? Not just famous among rail fans, but famous. Newspaper headlines in 45 different states, magazine covers, television segments. People who have never been near a railroad in their life knowing its name by heart. Apparently, it takes this. The Union Pacific Big Boy. And before we even get into the specs, because trust me, the specs are insane, we need to talk about where this machine came from. Because the origin story alone is worth the price of admission. It's 1941. Union Pacific has a problem. Their main freight route through the Wasatch Mountains in Utah has a grade of 1. 14%, which doesn't sound like much until you're trying to push thousands of tons of freight up it every single day. They were using helper locomotives, double heading, running extra crews, all of it expensive, all of it slow. They needed one locomotive that could handle the whole run. Solo, no helpers, no babysitting. So they went to the American Locomotive Company, ALCO, in Schenectady, New York, and basically said, build us something that doesn't exist yet. ALCO delivered. And here's the moment that made history not on the tracks, but in the factory. While the very first locomotive was still being built, an unknown worker walked up to the smoke box, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote 2 words on the metal. Big Boy. Nobody knows who he was. His name was never recorded. But Union Pacific looked at it, loved it, and kept it. The locomotive was originally going to be called the Wasatch Class Sensible, Geographical, Completely Forgettable. Instead, it became Big Boy. And that name spread across the country faster than the locomotive itself ever could. Most locomotives have one job: burn fuel, make steam, move. This one had to do something extra. It had to survive a desert with almost no water in sight. South Africa, 1953, the railways needed to push freight lines through the Great Karoo, one of the most arid, unforgiving stretches of land on the African continent. Thousands of square miles of dry scrubland where water sources were either too far apart, too scarce, or simply didn't exist at the scale a steam locomotive needs. And a steam locomotive needs a lot of water. So engineers did something that had never been successfully pulled off at this scale before. They built a locomotive that recycled its own steam. Here's how it worked. Normally when a steam locomotive exhausts spent steam, it blasted straight out of the chimney, gone forever. The Class 25 captured that steam instead, piped it back into a massive condensing tender, cooled it back down into water using radiator panels and roof-mounted fans, and fed it right back into the boiler. The result? This locomotive could run 700 miles without taking on a single drop of fresh water. 700 miles. In a desert. On recycled steam. 90 of these were built between 1953 and 1955, constructed by North British Locomotive Company in Scotland and Henschel and Son in Germany. And the crews who operated them gave them a nickname almost immediately. Camels. Because just like a camel crossing the Sahara, these machines could go further on less water than anything else around them. But nothing this clever comes without a price. Because the steam wasn't exhausting through the chimney anymore, the natural drafting effect that keeps a firebox burning was completely gone. So engineers had to install a turbine-driven fan inside the smoke box just to keep the fire alive, and those fan blades got destroyed constantly by hot char particles coming off the fire. High maintenance. Complex systems. Expensive to keep running. By the 1970s, diesel and electric traction had taken over the desert routes, and the condensers were converted to standard locomotives. Today, only one original Class 25 condenser survives in its unmodified form. But for 2 decades, it did what everyone said couldn't be done. It crossed the desert. Without stopping. Without drinking. Not every machine on this list is extreme because of its size. Some are extreme because of what they could do that nothing else could. Meet the Shay. And before you say anything, yes, it looks weird. The boiler sits crooked, deliberately offset to the left. It moves at 18 miles an hour on a good day. Next to a big boy or a Yellowstone, it looks almost comically small. But here's the thing. Put a big boy on a steep forest grade with rough, uneven track, and it will spin its wheels, lose traction, and sit there going nowhere. Put a Shay on that same grade, and it climbs it. Quietly, steadily, without breaking a sweat. That was the whole point. The story starts with a man named Ephraim Shay. And honestly, his background alone is worth talking about, because he wasn't a trained engineer. He was a school teacher, a Civil War hospital clerk, a logger, a merchant, just a man who had a problem and refused to accept that nobody had solved it yet. The problem was simple. He needed to move logs out of Michigan forests in the 1870s, but the track he could afford to lay was rough, uneven, and full of sharp curves. Standard locomotives of the era needed smooth, well-maintained track and gentle grades to function properly. The forests didn't offer any of that, so Shay built his own solution. Instead of driving wheels directly through side rods connected to pistons, the way every conventional locomotive worked, Shay mounted his cylinders vertically on the right side of the locomotive. Those cylinders drove a horizontal crankshaft. That crankshaft connected to drive shafts running the full length of the locomotive. And those drive shafts powered every single axle through bevel gears. Every single axle, that's the secret. On a conventional locomotive, only certain wheels are powered. On a Shay, all of them are, which means all of the locomotive's weight is working for traction at the same time, which means it can climb grades steeper than 5% grades that would make a standard locomotive completely useless. Shay patented the design in 1881. Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio built the first one and ended up producing 2,767 of them over the next 65 years. They ranged from tiny 6-ton machines all the way up to 162-ton giants, the same fundamental design scaled across an enormous range of sizes and jobs. Logging operations across America swore by them. Mining companies loved them. They went to Australia, New Zealand, South America, anywhere humans needed to move heavy things up impossibly difficult terrain on track that wasn't worth spending real money on. Slow? Absolutely unstoppable? Pretty much. The Shay never made headlines the way the big boy did. Nobody chalked a famous nickname on its smoke box. But without it, the great American logging era looks completely different. The forests got opened up because this crooked little machine could go where nothing else would follow. Let me ask you something. What's the hardest environment you can think of to run a railway in? Extreme cold? Mountain terrain? Total darkness for months at a time? How about all three simultaneously every single day of the year? Because that's exactly what this locomotive deals with. Welcome to the Arctic Circle, specifically northern Sweden, a place called Kiruna, one of the most remote mining towns on Earth, sitting well above the Arctic Circle where winter temperatures regularly drop to minus 40 degrees, where daylight disappears completely for weeks at a time, where ice and snow aren't seasonal inconveniences, they're just the permanent conditions of life. And somewhere up there right now, a locomotive is hauling 8,600 tons of iron ore through all of it. Meet the IORE. Built by a Trans, later taken over by Bombardier, and introduced in the year 2000 for a Swedish mining company called LKAB. Their job is to take iron ore from the mines in Kiruna and Gällivare and move it to the port of Narvik in Norway, crossing a mountain range in the process, where ships are waiting to carry it to steel mills across Europe. Now here's where the numbers get serious. The IORE operates in paired sets, 2 locomotives working together as one unit. Combined, they produce 10,800 kilowatts of power. Their combined tractive effort hits 1,200 kilonewtons, making this paired unit the most powerful locomotive combination in Europe. Each train they haul is 750 meters long. That's nearly half a mile of loaded ore wagons with a gross weight of 8,600 tons. These are the heaviest trains regularly operated anywhere in Europe. Not occasionally, every single day. But here's the detail I really want you to think about. The route goes downhill from the mines to the port when the train is fully loaded and uphill on the return journey when it's empty. The IORE uses regenerative braking on the way down, converting all that momentum back into electricity and feeding it directly into the national power grid. A locomotive that powers homes on its way to work. That's genuinely impressive engineering. Now remember I mentioned minus 40 degrees? Every single component in this locomotive had to be designed and tested to function in that cold. Sealed systems, specialized lubrication that doesn't freeze, heating elements built into critical components. Because at minus 40, standard diesel fuel turns to gel and standard lubricants stop working entirely. The IORE is electric, which helps, but the engineering required to keep every system alive in Arctic conditions is a whole separate story on its own. And here's the detail that absolutely nobody talks about the name. IORE is a combination of 2 things. Iron ore, obvious enough, and Eeyore, the sad donkey from Winnie the Pooh, spelled IOR in Swedish. One of the most powerful locomotives on the planet, doing one of the most demanding jobs on the planet, named after a fictional depressed donkey. You genuinely cannot make that up. 34 of these locomotives are in service today. They run year-round without pause. They've replaced older locomotives that simply couldn't handle the increasing weight demands of modern ore trains. And every single day, in the dark, in the cold, in conditions most machines wouldn't survive, they show up and do the job. Quietly, powerfully, and apparently a little sadly. Now most people, when they think of powerful locomotives, they picture something old, something smoky, something American. But what if I told you that right now, today, one country is running a fleet of electric freight locomotives so powerful, so massive in scale, that engineers across the world had to stop and take notice. Welcome to India and welcome to the WAG-12. India's railways are, to put it simply, enormous. We're talking about one of the busiest rail networks on the entire planet, moving millions of tons of freight every single day. But by the early 2000s, the system was hitting its limits. Trains were slow, locomotives were underpowered, and the new dedicated freight corridors being built across the country needed something the old fleet just couldn't deliver. So India didn't patch the problem. They went and built a monster. The WAG-12 puts out 12,000 horsepower. That is twice the power of the locomotive that replaced the WAG-9. Twice. In one generation. And it can haul over 6,000 tons at up to 120 kilometers per hour. It's built on Indian broad gauge, which is actually the widest major gauge in the world, and it runs on 25,000 volts of overhead ACT power. But here's what really sets this thing apart. It's not just one of these that exists. As of right now, India has built over 600 of them. 600. And they're still counting. The whole thing was built under India's Make in India initiative. Nearly 90% of the components are domestically produced. There's a brand new factory in Madhepura, Bihar, that was built from scratch, specifically for this locomotive, pumping out roughly 120 units a year. Oh, and the crew cab? Air conditioning. A toilet. Food storage. Because when you're the country moving mountains of coal and grain across an entire subcontinent, your drivers probably deserve a seat that doesn't feel like a punishment. The WAG-12 isn't just a locomotive. It's a statement that extreme engineering isn't a thing of the past. And it certainly isn't just a Western story anymore. If you made it this far, you already know you're the kind of person who actually appreciates this stuff, so do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because we're just getting started. Drop in the comments which locomotive on this list do you think deserves the title of most extreme. I read every single one. See you in the next one.